What I thought I'd do is tell you a brief little bit about myself and about my career, and then hopefully have time to share with you some of the things that I think you might find helpful as you leave high school and continue on with your life. So, as Mr. Stewart said, I was born and raised here in Owensboro. My mother still lives here. My father has passed. 4 brothers. All 4 of us graduated from Apollo, with my brother Mike being the first in the first inaugural class. Also wish him a happy birthday. His birthday's tomorrow. My oldest brother, unfortunately, graduated from Davis County High School. But we forgive him for that because he was not eligible to graduate from Apollo based on his age. So I graduated from Apollo in 1977. From there, I went to Murray State graduated with a degree, a double major in psychology and sociology. I thought I was going to be a psychologist, but life had different plans. So as I got out of college, I worked at a girls' home for a period of time where it was for girls between 10 and 18 that couldn't stay in their own homes for different reasons. It was nice work. It was enjoyable. I learned a lot, but wasn't quite what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew that wasn't it. So at the behest of my parents, who both worked for the government, I ended up applying for and getting a job as a clerk with the government in a federal probation and parole office. Now, for those of you that don't know government speak, that's another word for secretary. But it was a good job. It paid well. Again, I learned a lot. But once again, not exactly what I wanted to do. Through a series of events that started with me going to work at the Federal Probation Office, I met a Secret Service agent, and several months later found out from him that the Secret Service was hiring special agents. I thought, okay. I knew of federal agents from my father being in the FBI, but it was not a career I had ever thought about, but I was looking for something different. So I called him, and I talked to him, and I said, tell me what you guys do. I don't really know. So he explained, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but he explained the job to me as best as he could, because there's nothing normal 9 to 5 about being a federal agent. But I thought, that sounds pretty awesome. So I applied and got hired. And as Mr. Stewart said, in May of 1984, I began my career. Part of that involved 4 months, back then it's now 6 to 7, but 4 months of formal training through 2 different training academies, and then a lot of on-the-job training. From there, after 26 years, which was my main career, I decided it was time for a change. So I left there and went to the United States Agency for International Development Office Inspector General, and worked there for about 5 years, and then retired in December of 2015, just at the end of last year. So in a nutshell, that's how we've gotten to this point. But let's go back a little bit. Let me tell you what some of those experiences were. The Secret Service, as I said, is a federal law enforcement organization. They were originally established in 1865 to suppress counterfeit currency, because at that time it was estimated that 1/2 to 2/3 of all currency in circulation was counterfeit. So on April 14th, 1865, the then Secretary of the Treasury went to President Lincoln and said, we have a problem here with all this counterfeit currency. Here's what I suggest. I'd like to form this federal law enforcement agency, because there weren't a lot back then. President Lincoln signed legislation to make that happen. Now, if you remember from your history classes, it was also then the night of April 14th, 1865, that President Lincoln went to Ford's Theater, was shot by John Wilkes Booth, and he died the next day. I mention that because in 1901, after President McKinley was the 3rd president to be assassinated, the Secret Service then started picking up responsibilities for presidential protection. I just think that's like one of these weird little twists of life, how things happen, so that's why I mention it. So yes, 2 main missions within the Secret Service. The investigative mission came first. It's expanded through the years. It still includes obligations to the United States, currency, bonds, those types of things. But it also is expanded now to include a variety of financial crimes, financial institution fraud, identity theft, credit card fraud. And the agency has become quite a leader in the area of cyber crimes, hackings, intrusions, network intrusions, those types of things. Much like the investigative mission, the protective mission is also expanded. So it is not only the president and his family, vice president and his family, former presidents, and typically spouses, and then a few elected or other U.S. government officials, But in about 1970, I think they added the protection of visiting heads of state and visiting heads of government to the United States when they come here. So all that protection is done by the Secret Service. Okay, what does that mean? What did I do? Well, as Mr. Stewart said, I was a special agent. So I started out, special agents, again, if you're not clear on it, are law enforcement officers. They carry guns and badges and handcuffs. They can make arrests. They can execute search warrants, testify in federal court. I did all that. Awesome, right? Well, I also worked undercover, conducted surveillance. I drove armored limousines, sometimes onto airplanes. I did protection details all around the world. I was the head of the detail for Angela Merkel one year, for Vladimir Putin, among others, but those are some of the bigger ones. I did a little bit of everything. I was an agency spokesperson. I worked in their internal affairs unit for a couple iterations. In my 26 years, I had 11 different assignments, and I took 4 moves. I had to move for the first one, but I guess that technically doesn't count. When I left there, as I said, I went to the United States Agency for International Development, Office of Inspector General, AID-OIG, or the IG's office. It is also, the IG's office, the part I was in, were also federal agents. For those of you not familiar with USAID, it is the development arm for the State Department. So as such, they work in primarily third world countries, working to improve the quality of life for people and helping to put forth the United States foreign policies. And they do that by working to improve education, infrastructure, government, democracy, those types of things. Our role in the IG's office was to ensure kind of twofold. One, that the monies appropriated to that agency were being used as were appropriated, and that people weren't trying to skim off the top or outright steal to better their own selves. The other thing we had, and that was probably about 80% of our work, program fraud, a lot of contract procurement fraud, that type of thing. Not very interesting stuff, but important stuff. And then we also were responsible for conducting investigations into allegations of misconduct on the part of employees of the agency. So as a government employee, there are most employers have certain expectations. It's a little more heightened, I think, in the federal government because most people have clearances. There's a whole deal with protecting classified information. So I mention all that to kind of show you, maybe I have a little bit of bona fides about what I'm talking about, because as I retired from the Secret Service, I had worked my way up into the senior executive service, which I won't get in a lot of detail, but it's the top level of government. Less than 1% of all federal employees are in the senior executive service. So again, not to brag on myself, but to kind of give you a background that maybe some of these things that I'm going to share with you could be helpful. So let's get into some of the tips, some of the things that I think would be helpful. First and foremost, as you get ready to graduate, have a plan for moving forward. You got to have some idea of what you're going to do. Even, like when I retired, my plan was for the first year I was not going to do much of anything, just enjoy my retirement. But that was a plan. So have a plan. You guys can't do that. You're too young. Have a plan, but be ready to adapt. Like I said, I thought I was going to be a psychologist, but quite frankly, after my 16 years of formal education, I decided I was ready for a change. I didn't want to stay in school any longer. So that led to the working at the girls' home and then ultimately becoming a federal agent. Nothing I would have thought of, but it ended up being pretty amazing for me. So think about that. Be willing to step outside your comfort zone and take chances. When I joined the Secret Service, less than 4% of the agent population was female. Now, if I had listened to conventional wisdom at that time, I never would have become an agent because women just didn't do that. If I had listened to conventional wisdom in the 9th grade, I would not have become the manager of the boys' football team. That was one of those weird little things that came about. One day in block class, do they still have block? It was a sort of? Okay. It was a 2-hour block of classes for English and civics. And the coach, one of the teachers at that time was the coach of the boys' freshman football team, Coach Willen. He came into class one day and said, "Hey, all right, guys, we need a manager for the football team. We're looking for volunteers." I'm fuzzy on a whole lot of those details, but I do know at some point I raised my hand and said, "Hey, Coach, I'll do it." Well, after the laughter died from not only the teachers, but my peers and classmates, and most likely the boys on the football team. I think the general reaction was, well, you can't do that because you're a girl. Well, that didn't really satisfy me. That didn't really make sense to me. Why? I was born a girl. I can't do anything about that. I have 4 brothers, and maybe that may embolden me a little bit, but ultimately I was allowed to do that. I think that was a really good experience for me because, believe it or not, I'm actually very introverted. I don't put myself out there very much, but by doing that and by the faculty and staff supporting that, it allowed me to realize that you can do a lot of things that maybe you or other people don't think you can do. So think about that a little bit as you're moving forward. I think for me what was really important was finding something that had meaning to me, something that appealed to me. When I went to the Secret Service, their mission was to protect the financial infrastructure of the United States as well as to protect the President and Vice President, elected officials of the United States government. Well, I'm sorry to admit that I have very vague memories of the Kennedy assassination, President Kennedy assassination in 1963. Don't remember the details, but I do remember adults were very sad, a lot of crime was going on, day-to-day life was just disrupted, and it was just a very, very somber time. I mean, that was very horrific experience for our country. I do remember in 1981 the attempt on President Reagan. I remember because at that point I was in my last semester of college. It was a lot of chaos, a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty as to what this meant for our country until we knew that he was going to be okay. So this mission of keeping elected leaders safe to me translated to protecting a way of life here in the United States, protecting our democracy and the way we know. So that was me. It could be anything, but I think you're going to like what you do a lot more if you kind of believe in what you're doing. Don't let others tell you what is right or wrong for you. So I talked about a couple of those examples. When in order to move into the senior executive service, there's a formal program that you have to go through. And part of that is a 2-week in-class training that you have to take. So we're in there, and one day they give us a personality preference profile. Have any of y'all ever taken one of those? No? Part of what it's designed to do is you go through, and it asks you all these different questions, and at the end of it, it kind of suggests career tracks that may be good for you. So I take the test, hand it in. A day or two later, I get the results back. And as they're handing them out, the facilitator runs up to me and she goes, "Oh my gosh, what are you going to do?" I said, "About what?" She said, "Well, based on the results of your profile, you are probably in the absolute worst job that you could ever be in, based on your personality preference." Well, to myself, I thought, well, that explains maybe why I was under stress a little more sometimes than my colleagues. But what I said to her is, I really appreciate your feedback, but at this point I'm eligible for retirement, and my agency believes in me enough and thinks I'm doing a good enough job that I have some potential to move forward, so I'm going to stick around and tough it out and see what happens. So the point of that is, you may have your preferences, but you can certainly learn to move outside of those. As I said, I'm not particularly fond of talking in front of people, but I've learned to do it because it came with the job. I threw this one just in here just so I could tell this quick little story. Being different isn't bad. I've talked about a lot of my experience at the time I was starting my career and coming up was being a female in a predominantly man's world. But there were times that worked to my advantage. I was in the Louisville field office, my first office, and I had worked a case involving the theft and negotiation of some U.S. Treasury checks. Identified a suspect, gone to court, and gotten an arrest warrant for this guy. So go out and try to find him. He's never home, can never find him. Wasn't a big crime, but it was a federal crime, but it wasn't a violent crime, wasn't a big deal. So I knew we'd get him eventually. Had nothing to lose, so I left a note on his door saying, "Please call me, I'd like to talk with you." Lo and behold, he gives me a call. All right, that's a good move. So I explained to him that we need to talk a little bit more about this issue. So he comes, I said, can you come and meet me at my office? Sure, I'll be happy to, he says. He comes down, we go into one of the interview rooms, go through some preliminary stuff, and I say, well, I'm so glad you came in today because I have a warrant for your arrest. He was stunned. He sat there and he said to me, well, the only reason I came in here is because I didn't think you could do anything to me because I knew you were a girl. I said, well, sorry, you lose on this one, buddy. But I didn't get upset. I didn't get offended. But again, that worked to my advantage. So, think about that as you navigate your life. Learn as much as you can about what you committed yourself to and make yourself an asset. I could have not had 4 moves, and I could not have had 11 different assignments, but in any job I've had, I've tried to learn as much as I could about the agency or about the place where I was working. So I made sure that I had a variety of experiences so that I became kind of very knowledgeable about the workings of the organization. When I was at Ponderosa in high school, working at the Ponderosa Steakhouse that's no longer here, I tried to do every job there just so for me, it makes it better. It's easier to understand it all. Big picture thinking. So I would suggest that you do that. Advocate for yourself. You know yourself better and what your accomplishments have been. So stand up for yourself and put yourself out there and speak up when you need to. At one point, all agents get to a certain level, and then beyond that, it becomes a competition. You compete for promotion. So it's a multi-step process, but one step of that is that your supervisor gives you a score, which is kind of the underlying basis for a lot of this. So we were in the car one day riding out to the training facility for a graduation, and he says, well, I'm going to give you a score. Your score this year is going to be okay, but it's not going to make you competitive. It's your first year of eligibility, and I just, that's just the way it goes. I said, all right, I'll respect your judgment, but let me just remind you that the reason I'm just eligible now is because I moved 3 times before I got promoted before. A lot of my peers got promoted in the first or second office, but I took 3 different moves before I got promoted. Secondly, I'm in my 5th assignment, 2 of which are somewhat unusual that not too many agents get to do, so I think I have a little bit better idea of what the agency does than some of my colleagues. But that being said, I defer to your judgment. Well, that was the only conversation we had. I didn't press him on it. I didn't yell and scream. I just said, here's my side of things. Well, when the promotion scores came out, I had the highest score, and I got promoted on the first list out of there. So now, to me, that was a little better tact than the guy that came to me when I was his boss and said, I'm ready to be promoted. I should be promoted. I said, all right, tell me why you're ready to be promoted. He said, well, I've got 20 years with the agency, and I've had 2 assignments at the lower level. I said, and? That's it. He didn't tell me about his skills. He didn't tell me anything compelling. So advocate for yourself, but make sure you have something to support what you're advocating for. Introspection is a good thing. One of the things I found out, and I'll go back to being the manager of the football team, that was very unlike me, but I think that one of the things I've learned about myself, I don't like being told I can't do things. So sometimes that's helpful, but it's also good to understand that about yourself, because that way when somebody says, for instance, I bet you $20 you won't go streaking through the airport, I know where that line is. I don't cross that line. But so be honest with yourself, but you can learn a lot about yourself that way too. Be kind to others. That's one of my big things, is being nice to people, but also be kind to yourself. It's easy to be very critical of yourself if you make a mistake or when you compare yourself to others, but that's part of the introspection part is think about what you've done, give yourself credit for the things you've accomplished, and don't be too hard on yourself, because there are a lot of people out there that keep things to themselves, that have issues and problems you don't even know about. So, be a little nice to yourself. Being uncomfortable is to be expected. There are a lot of times that, I was on edge. You get a little worked, you get a little anxious, you get a little anxiety, but that means you're paying attention. and you're realizing that you're walking into something that may not be as familiar to you. Or, for instance, when we would execute search warrants, you want to be a little anxious. You want to be a little uncomfortable because you want to be prepared to react if something happens. So it's not a bad thing. And I know Carrie Walsh-Jennings, if you guys keep up with the Olympics, she was one of the U.S. women's beach volleyball players. She won 3 gold medals in the previous 3 Olympics. She was going for a 4th this year. Unfortunately, ended up with a bronze, but I saw a special on her, and she said, you know, doubt is inevitable and fear is inevitable. Sometimes you have to live in these places that are uncomfortable in order to be successful. Certainly not every day. If you're uncomfortable every day in what you're doing, it might be time to do something else. But a little bit, that's okay. And lastly, because I know we're running out of time, life is a lot better if you can keep a sense of humor. People don't like being around negative people. I've found in our family, and certainly in my life, I like to kid around a lot. So just try to have fun and enjoy what life brings you.